It is good to be together again today, and so I greet you, each of you this morning, in the name of Jehovah Jireh, our provider. I greet you this morning in the name of the shepherd who longs to lead his sheep by still waters into green pastures. And I greet you this morning in the name of the great shepherd Jesus, who loves his sheep. He leads his sheep. In fact, he gave his life for the sheep. And he would that not one would perish. He is a patient and a loving shepherd, and he leaves the 99 that are in the fold. He said so himself, and he searches for the one who is lost. And it is out of his great love that he has provided a way that every sheep, every person can be saved. Have you allowed the shepherd to draw you into the fold? Have you allowed his spirit to fill you? Have you surrendered your passions, your desires, even your life to the great provider, the one who is able to calm your fears, and the one who is able to give peace in the midst of a storm? I'm excited to bring you again a word from God this morning, and so I welcome each of you who are gathered here. Welcome to those who are joining online or on Facebook, and I trust that through these words, through the message today, the Holy Spirit will bring encouragement to you in your situation. I plan to continue the sermon series on that I've entitled Traveling Light, setting down the burdens or the satchels or the bags that we tend to carry. All of us do it. As we live, we pick up things and we carry them, and it prevents us, carrying this extra baggage prevents us from running or living well. And this morning I plan to speak from the 5th verse of the 23rd Psalm. All of us at some point have asked God, where is your provision? Where are you? You know, if we say he's the great provider, and yet it seems I'm experiencing more loss than provision. Some of us have felt that recently. No doubt all of us have felt it at some point. Just a week ago, I shared a message on verse 4. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. It seems that David understood where to go in that dark time of need. And he follows that verse with this verse of preparing a table in the presence of enemies. And that's what we're going to focus on this morning. And yet, as we go through that valley of the shadow of death, I'm sure many of us have asked the question, if God is a provider, what's with all the suffering, the conflict, the loss? You see, you and I are human. We think in human terms. And oftentimes when I think of blessings, I think of physical blessings. I think of wealth and equate blessings with money and comfort and such. God is spiritual. When Jesus met with the lady at the well in Samaria in John chapter 4, at the end of the meeting with the people of the village, he says, God is a spirit, and anyone who wishes to worship him must worship him in spirit. He is spiritual, and many times his blessings are spiritual as well. We tend to think that if we follow God, life should become easy. We tend to think, God, I've given so much for you. Now I'm ready for early retirement or whatever it is. And yet throughout Scripture, we're reminded, God himself says, if you follow me, you're going to be hated. In the last day that he spent with the disciples, when he prayed for them, he said, If you choose to be my follower, you're going to be hated by the people around you. But remember, that's because of me, not because of you. They're going to hate you because they hated me first. That's from John 17. The last verse in John 16, it says this, in the world, you're going to have tribulation and trouble. And so why are we surprised when it comes? Jesus said that's how it is on earth. He said this place is broken. I'm paraphrasing now. He said, in the world, you're going to have trouble. You're going to have pain. You're going to have loss. And so I'm telling you these things so that in me you can have peace. That's what he says. John chapter 16, verse 33. I'm telling you, I'm giving you a heads up. That's how it's going to be. But I'm telling you so that you can, when it comes, you can have peace in me. And he says, be of good cheer, however, because I am an overcomer. And that's what we want to focus on this morning, is that he is an overcomer. We are reminded, Jesus also said this, all who are godly in Christ Jesus will face persecution. If God's blessing would be physical, have you ever thought of this? If God's blessing would only be physical, in comfort and ease and such, we wouldn't face death. Even everyone will face that appointment. We were reminded of that a week ago. Excuse me. And so I'm excited this morning to share with you some encouragement from the 5th verse of the 23rd Psalm. Let's read it again together at this time. Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Let's read it out loud together. You can see it on the screen behind me. All together. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Verse 5. Throughout my life, I've struggled to understand what this verse means. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Verses 1 to 4 make sense. Being led to still waters and green pastures and passing through the valley of the shadow of death and not fearing evil because he is with me. But then the table before in the presence of enemies, I didn't get it. And yet, as you know, the reality is I want to be far away from my enemies. I don't even want to eat there. I don't want to sit in the presence of enemies. And yet, as I was preparing for this sermon, this verse covered me with a great blanket of peace, and I trust that it will do the same for you. There are 3 phrases we'll be looking at. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. The second, you anoint my head with oil. And finally, my cup overflows. Again, some of these thoughts are drawn from Max Lucado's book entitled Traveling Lights. Have you ever done something? The first phrase, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Have you ever done something or said something that you wish with all your heart you could go back and undo? All of us have. We've been there. Who hasn't? I'd like to take us to a scene that happened earlier in, not earlier from David, but it happened a long time ago. And that scene is just prior to the betrayal of Jesus. Peter the passionate, Peter the impetuous Peter, the apostle Peter. They're sitting with Jesus at the Last Supper, and Jesus is telling them that you're going to face hard things. In the next couple days, someone's going to betray me, and I'm going to be killed. And you guys are all going to desert me. And Peter stands up and says, no, Lord, not me. I would go to prison for you. I would even die for you, Jesus. Not me. And Jesus looks at him and says, Peter, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny knowing me 3 times. Peter didn't believe it. You see, it's the night of the betrayal, hiding in the shadows. Now we know what happened, and there's Peter. He's not whimpering. He's not sniffling. Picture Peter. Every picture about him is a large, strong man, a brute, a brawling man. Picture him in the darkness there now. He is weeping, bawling, bearded face in his thick hands because of what he did. The night of the betrayal, things weren't going the way that Peter thought they should. Isn't that how life is sometimes? Have you been there? We have our best laid plans, and it doesn't go that way. And it gets confusing. And suddenly we're saying, God, where are you now? This is Peter's situation. They went to the garden to pray. He seems to have missed the point that Jesus said that he's going to be killed and betrayed. And the religious people are coming at 3 a.m. into the garden. There they are with their torches. Peter, he meant what he said when he said, I would die for you. He grabbed his sword and he went after them to defend. And he took a good swing at the servant of Malchus. And he was either a bad shot or Malchus was agile, but we know he just got the side of his head. I expect when we get to heaven, and I've probably said this before, but I expect we'll see that servant there. How could it be otherwise? How could it? And Jesus looks at Peter right there and says, Peter, put that sword away. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. This is all part of the plan, is what Jesus is saying. Perhaps that's true when my life is not going the way I planned for it to go. When it feels like everything's being turned upside down. When it feels like this is just not how I meant for things to work out. Perhaps Jesus is saying, Calvin, trust me on this one. Leave this one with me. It's a confusing night for Peter, but that Jesus not only rebukes his follower, the one who left everything, left his job, left his family for large sections of time, left his wife to follow Jesus. Is that not enough? Did I not give enough? Is that perhaps what Peter's asking Jesus? What's going on? And then Jesus turns to the one who is here to arrest him, and he reaches down, and I can imagine this guy is rolling around in the dirt, grasping the side of his face, and and there's blood, and he says, and he reaches down and he heals him. I can only imagine that servant must have been touching the side of his face, and he must have wondered, what are we doing? As did Peter. The difference is perhaps we identify with Peter. Perhaps we're saying, God, I've given to you as well. I've served you. I've sacrificed for you. This isn't making sense. I don't understand. And we know that from that garden, Peter followed at a distance, and there he is slinking in the shadows before the before the denial. And the person says, oh, that man is with Jesus. He knows him. And in Matthew chapter 26, he says, Peter cursed and swore and said, I don't know the man. And that was within hearing distance for Jesus. And it says that Jesus turned and looked at Peter, and the rooster crowed. Here he is, in a whirlpool of shame, in a whirlpool of sorrow. Now he's hiding. He's ashamed. He has picked up that satchel. In a few days, he's going to head back to Galilee. He's going to go back to you know what he's going to do? He's going to go fishing. I always thought, that just makes sense because, maybe he needs to unwind a little bit, and that's what we do, right? For those of us who enjoy fishing, it's less about catching the fish than it's just you get out into that peak. That's how I pictured this. In John 21, probably around verse 6, it says, and Simon Peter saith unto him, I go a-fishing, King James Version, because I highlighted that verse. I thought that's just scripture that I should obey. And think about this. He's going back to the life that he left. Peter got up and said, I'm going to Galilee. I'm going back to be a fisherman. I wonder if he didn't think there's no room at the table for me. Don't you think that only makes sense? I can't believe what I've done. He must have wondered, does Jesus have room for a guy like me? Have we not asked ourselves the same thing? Is Peter the only guy that did what he swore he'd never do? Have you and I not? I'm never going to do that again. I'm never going to look at that again. And we find ourselves, after making that commitment, going back again. I am going to control my tongue. I got to stop swearing. I am turning my back on gossip, and yet we turn to it again and again. I'm done making shady deals. I've learned my lesson. I'm done flirting. It's hurtful. No more gossip. No more. And the rooster crows. Conviction pierces our heart, and we partner in the darkness with Peter. And we pick up the satchel of shame and wear it and wonder if Jesus has any use for struggling people like us. Perhaps, like Peter, we return to our old lives. He went fishing. Perhaps we think it's not worth it. Well, fortunately, even the resurrection isn't the end of a story. And Jesus, if Peter wondered if there's any room, if Jesus has any room for him, Jesus answered that question. I said in about verse 6 of John 21, he said he's going fishing. And he and a couple other disciples joined him, actually. And they go out and they're fishing. They're confused, likely angry. And Peter is carrying a world of shame. You and I identify with that. Who here has not ever been at that place where you're filled with shame for what you've done? Anyone who understands the call of Jesus, of God on their lives, has experienced that, because at that point we realize the holiness of God and the depravity of humanity. And as they are coming into shore, the men are starting to look at I can picture it's foggy, and they're looking at the shore and someone's there. Someone's got a fire going. And Jesus is sitting by the coals. He came to Galilee. He is sitting by the coals. And he has spread out the table in the presence of the enemy of shame, in the presence of the enemy of regret, of guilt, of fear, of lies. You see, I wonder, and he says, Peter, come here. He has prepared a meal of broiling fish and bread on those coals. How did Peter feel? Perhaps you and I can identify. As they approach shore, there is Jesus inviting them. The ruler of heaven and earth. The defeater of hell and Satan. You see, the devil sifted Peter. The devil thought he had Peter. He picked on Peter. He got Peter. And the ruler of heaven and earth, the defeater of hell, extended his hands to Peter and said, Peter, come to the table. And he is saying the same to you and me. He's saying, Calvin, put your own name in there. Come to the table. You are not past my forgiveness. You are not past hope. You are not past my grace and mercy. And that brings us then to the last phrase of some things overflowing. You see, Jesus prepared a table, and he has prepared a table for you and I as well. I'm not going to read these verses. However, in Ephesians 6, Paul writes, and we are reminded that our battle is not against humanity. So when we think of our enemies, and if human names come into mind, well, maybe there's something else that we need to deal with there. But our enemies are not flesh and blood. Our enemies are spiritual darkness and demons and principalities in high places that with which you and I cannot contend physically. We need the Spirit of Jesus, and he was inviting Peter to receive that Spirit. Jesus has invited a table in the presence of your enemies also. In Revelation chapter 3, verse 20, he says this, "Here I am. I am standing at the door, knocking. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in." And King James Version says, "and sup with him. I will eat with him. I will break bread with that person." Jesus has prepared a table. And finally, the last table that we're going to look at this morning is when we get together to break bread in his commemoration. In fact, the Last Supper for him, what you might remember in Mark 14, he tells the disciples to go down into the village, and you're going to see a man there, and you're just going to ask him, he says, ask him if we can use his room. It's prepared. Jesus had made those arrangements. This was not just a miraculous thing. I mean, he sometimes did stuff like that where he said, you go into the village, there's going to be a guy with a young colt on a different occasion, and just tell him that I need that colt, and he's going to let you. That's miraculous. That is prophetic. That's Jesus. In this case, Jesus had prepared the room for the Last Supper. He was hosting the disciples. He had gone ahead. And so now he's just telling them, that's where the room is. Just go in and tell them that you're with me. He prepared the table. And you'll remember that one of the people at that table did not finish the meal. You know the story. Judas Iscariot was at the table. And halfway through, Peter looks at him and says, "That which you want to do, do it quickly." And he got up and left. You see, because at God's table, there's no room for the devil. There's no room for followers of the devil. There is room at the table for those who, for those who have chosen to follow him. And that's the same when we break bread. There's something dynamic about that dismissal. I wonder what the disciples thought. Jesus had prepared a table in the presence of the enemy. Judas was allowed to see the supper, but he wasn't allowed to stay there. He wasn't welcome there. And this is how much he loves us. If any doubt remains, lest there are Peters here, lest there are Peters listening, if any doubt remains, whether there is room at the table for you, remember, the table was surrounded by Peters, by doubters, by betrayers who were committed to Christ. And at that table, Jesus took a cup, and he says this. This is from Matthew 26. From Matthew 26, and he says this. Now listen up. Every one of you drink this cup. Okay. He didn't say, measure up and drink this cup. He says, every one of you. I remember being at the table sometimes and feeling, I don't know if I should commune. Like, I know my struggles. I know my sin. My sin is under the blood. And yet, I had but Jesus says this. I had a poor understanding of perhaps what that means. And Jesus says this, every one of you drink, because this is my blood, which is the new covenant between God and his people. The blood is poured out for many to forgive their sins. Every one of you drink this. Those who feel unworthy, drink this. Those who feel ashamed, drink this. Those who feel embarrassed, drink this. That's the table to which you are invited. You anoint my head with oil. You know, just thinking of coming to that table yet, I remember I heard someone saying this recently, when we get to heaven. You know, there's going to be quite a lot of amazing things. He said, you know, I'm probably going to be amazed at some people who are there. I'm going to be amazed at some people who aren't there. But mostly, I'm going to be amazed that I'm there. What a great perspective. He invites us to come to the table. You don't deserve it. You've done nothing other than accept the invitation. That's amazing. You anoint my head with oil. Ancient shepherds used oil for three things. So David is speaking here from sort of a perspective of a shepherd. One of the things that even in the green pastures, they were always on the lookout for adders. And that adder is a small snake who lives underground and makes its holes, little holes where it comes out. And what it does is when the sheep are feeding, it'll come out and bite its nose. And so when a shepherd sees an adder's hole, he would pour oil in it. It made it difficult for the adder to come up. And there was also a scent that the adders hated. And it also put that on the sheep's nose so that they would stay away. You see, the oil that Jesus pours on our heads as well he protects. But remember that it is a spiritual life. The second thing that they used oil for was to prevent conflicts. Especially in mating season, when the rams would start strutting around and they would look at you and say, I want you. And it's a dad thing. Or as Lakato says it, they put the ram into rambunctious, and they would start fighting over the ewes. And we've seen the videos, or perhaps seen it in our own farms, where two rams are butting heads. And the shepherd would take oil and put it on their heads to make them slippery so that they wouldn't hurt each other, so that they would deflect off each other. It was a way of preventing conflicts. And finally, and the most common use for oil was to heal. You see, sometimes it was to heal those heads that were butting, but most often it was just life in the pasture. The thistles would prick, the rocks would cut, and they would use oil. They would pour it into those wounds to bring healing. And God pours oil on us. You're going to get hurt. Life in the pasture is abrasive sometimes. And there are wounds. And so the oil of God is poured in there to bring healing. In Psalm 100, verse 3, he says this: "We belong to him. We are his people. He tends his sheep." Jesus brings healing. He tends his sheep. Go to him with your wounds. Who here has not experienced wounds? We've experienced that from other sheep, perhaps butting heads. We've experienced it from life in the pasture. Or perhaps we've been attacked by the enemy, those adders who are out to sting. And we're hurt, and we carry that. And God is waiting for us to come so that his oil can be poured in. It's really simple what he is asking us to do. Step one, he says, come to me. Go to him. David could have gone to other shepherds for advice. Could have said, I have this hurt. He could have gone to other counselors. He could have gone to other material. But he said, I go to the shepherd, and he anoints my head. He cares for you. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7. He cares for you. And the second step, to have oil poured on your head. It's hard to pour oil on someone's head if they're not bowing. Consider your posture before God. If we're angry with him, if we are wishing to give him advice, maybe, it's hard for him to pour the oil into our wound. Consider your posture and bow. Bow before him even when he doesn't make sense. He is God. Go to him and trust him. Bow before him and trust the healer with your wounds. And finally, my cup overflows. Perhaps the biggest thief for joy is envy. Envy comes when I look on others' things, on other people. Envy comes when I see the bad things in my life, the things that have disappointed me. And it robs us of any joy or pleasure. The last thing that we need to worry about is not having enough. Not having enough. There are times when it feels like in life the stresses are building up, and perhaps it feels like we don't have enough. But maybe the best thing that we can do is focus, if focusing on the things that are lacking leads to envy, then would it make sense if we focus on things that are unending, it would change our posture? So what do we have that is unending? According to God, he says this: the more we see our sinfulness, this is from the Living Bible, and it's from Romans chapter 5, verse 20. The more we see our sinfulness, the more we see God's abounding grace in forgiving us. Abounding grace. You can't outlive it. Should you worry that your cup will run dry, the cup of grace in your life will run dry? Do you think Paul struggled with that question? Think about it. Do you think he ever said, man, I was killing these people? Do you think he ever wondered that, what does God have for me? Does he have a room at the table for a guy like me? I zealously tried murdering every one of them. Do you think he ever met children whom he orphaned? It's quite possible. He was killing the church, literally. If those children were in the church, it is likely that he met children whom he orphaned. How did he wrestle with that question? How does God's forgiveness reach me? And here's the thing we need to realize, and that is simply this: you and I are as lost as Paul was before he met Jesus on the road to Damascus. Not one of us is closer than another. God's grace is simply abounding. It makes me think of that poem that I've read it so many times, but I'm going to again. Annie Flint, her life was far from perfect. She was physically, she was a paraplegic, incontinent, struggled with debilitating arthritis. She lived her life in pain. And she wrote these words: He giveth more, and it's an expression from her, He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the labors increase. To added afflictions, He adds His mercy. To multiplied trials, He adds His multiplied peace. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed or the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving has only begun. Fear not that thy need shall exceed His provision. Our Father ever yearns His resources to share. Lean hard on the arm, everlasting availing. The Father both thee and thy load will upbear. His love has no limits. His grace has no measure. His power no boundary known unto men. For out of the infinite riches of Jesus, He giveth and giveth and giveth again. Her life was anything but comfortable, and yet she experienced the overflowing cup. If focusing on the diminishing leads to envy, perhaps if we focus on the unending items, we will discover our cup overflowing. Focus on the abounding grace of Jesus and focus on the hope that you cannot exhaust. Romans chapter 15, verse 13. Romans 15:13 says this: God will help you overflow with hope in Him through the Holy Spirit's power within you. Overflowing with hope. Isaiah wrote about it. He wrote about God's abundant pardoning. For if you come to Him, He will abundantly pardon. That's overflowing again. Set your focus on the things of heaven, not on things of the earth. You are a spiritual being, and you will last forever. You will last forever. Your soul will last forever. And so let's stop focusing on what is earthly and carnal and temporal. and fix our eyes on what is eternal. For what we see is temporal, but what we cannot see is eternal. And live in the abundant grace and hope of Jesus Christ, and he will cause it to overflow from you, and accept his invitation to sit at the table, even in the presence of your enemies. God bless you as you continue to follow him.